At 2:15 in the morning, in a dimly lit bedroom in Washington, D.C., a man jolted awake to the sound of frantic knocking. Still half-dressed in the formal clothes he had worn to a political dinner, he stumbled to the door. The news waiting on the other side would change his life and the fate of the United States forever. The president was dying, and this man, who had spent much of his life dismissed as a machine politician, a collector of fine clothes, and a loyal servant of corruption, was about to become president himself. His name was Chester A. Arthur, and most Americans had no idea who he was. Even today, he remains one of the most unlikely and nearly forgotten presidents in American history. A man who rose from the shadows of political patronage to the highest office in the land, and then, against all expectations, transformed himself in ways that shocked both his enemies and his friends. To understand how that moment in the dark became possible, you have to go back nearly 50 years earlier to a small town in Vermont, where no one could have imagined that the infant born there would one day lead a divided nation. He was born on October 5, 1829, in Fairfield, Vermont, to a fiery Irish immigrant father and a deeply religious mother. His father, William Arthur, was a Baptist preacher who believed in abolition, education, and discipline. He moved his family constantly, chasing new church assignments and new opportunities. Young Chester grew up in a household where words mattered, ideas mattered, and ambition was not just encouraged, it was expected. But nothing about his childhood suggested future greatness. He was not born into wealth or political dynasty. He did not have powerful connections waiting for him. Instead, he had something quieter: determination, intelligence, and a deep awareness of how power worked. As a boy, he learned quickly that America was a land of contradictions. His father preached against slavery while living in a country where millions remained enslaved. His family struggled financially while hearing speeches about American prosperity. These contradictions left their mark on him. He excelled in school and eventually attended Union College in Schenectady, New York, graduating near the top of his class at just 18 years old. He was serious, disciplined, and ambitious, but he also had a growing taste for refinement. He loved good clothes, good company, and the image of success. After graduation, he became a school teacher, but teaching was never his true ambition. He wanted something more. He found it in the law. Moving to New York City, he entered a world unlike anything he had ever known. New York in the 1950s was a booming, chaotic metropolis filled with immigrants, merchants, politicians, and opportunity. It was also filled with corruption. Political power in New York was controlled by organizations known as political machines, networks of loyal men who traded jobs and favors for votes. The most powerful of these was connected to the Republican Party and would eventually shape Arthur's destiny. But before politics fully claimed him, Arthur made his name as a lawyer in a case that revealed something important about his character. In 1854, he helped defend a black schoolteacher named Elizabeth Jennings, who had been forcibly removed from a segregated streetcar. Arthur argued that segregation violated her rights. He won. It was a quiet victory, but a meaningful one. Long before the Civil War ended slavery, Arthur had helped challenge racial discrimination in the North. Yet idealism alone did not define him. Like many ambitious men of his era, he was drawn toward power. When the Civil War began in 1861, Arthur did not fight on the front lines. Instead, he served as quartermaster general for New York State. It was his job to supply soldiers with food, uniforms, and equipment. It was not glamorous work, but it was essential, and it introduced him to the mechanics of government on a massive scale. He proved efficient, organized, and capable. He also learned how political loyalty could be rewarded. After the war, Arthur became deeply connected to the Republican political machine run by one of the most powerful men in America, Roscoe Conkling. Conkling was a master of patronage politics. He believed that loyalty deserved reward and that government jobs were the currency of power. Arthur became one of his most trusted lieutenants. In 1871, Conkling secured Arthur one of the most lucrative and powerful positions in New York, Collector of the Port of New York. It may sound obscure today, but at the time it was one of the most important jobs in the federal government. The Port of New York was the gateway to America. Nearly anything entering the country passed through it, and the collector controlled thousands of jobs. Arthur now commanded an army of employees. Each one owed their position, directly or indirectly, to political loyalty. He dressed like a king. He wore silk hats, tailored suits, and elegant coats. He entertained lavishly. To reformers, he became the symbol of everything wrong with American politics. They accused him of caring more about style than substance, of rewarding loyalty over competence, of representing corruption itself. And yet, even his critics admitted something surprising. He ran the port efficiently. Still, efficiency was not enough. In 1777, a new president, Rutherford Hayes, entered office determined to reform the corrupt patronage system. Hayes targeted Arthur directly. After a bitter political fight, Hayes fired him. It was a humiliating blow. Arthur was out of power. Many assumed his career was finished. They were wrong, because even as reformers celebrated his fall, powerful forces inside the Republican Party were preparing his return. In 1880, the party faced a crisis. It was divided between reformers and machine politicians. They needed a compromise. They found it in a ticket that balanced both sides. At the top was a respected, reform-minded congressman from Ohio, James A. Garfield, and as vice president, they chose Chester A. Arthur. It was a strategic decision. Arthur reassured the political machines. Garfield reassured the reformers. Most Americans barely noticed Arthur. Vice presidents rarely mattered. They were political afterthoughts. Arthur himself reportedly admitted the vice presidency was a most insignificant office. He had no idea how wrong he was. On July 2, 1881, everything changed. President Garfield was walking through a Washington train station when a disgruntled office seeker named Charles Guiteau stepped forward and fired a gun. Garfield collapsed. Arthur was stunned. He knew what the country knew. If Garfield died, he would become president. But many Americans feared that possibility. Arthur was, in their minds, a creature of corruption, a man shaped by the very system reformers wanted to destroy. Some openly worried that the presidency itself might fall into the hands of machine politicians. Garfield lingered for months, suffering. Arthur waited. He did not campaign. He did not maneuver. He remained quiet. Then, on September 19, 1881, Garfield died, and in the darkness of that early morning, Arthur took the oath of office. He was now President of the United States. Few expected greatness. Many expected disaster. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable and least remembered transformations in American presidential history. And almost immediately, Arthur began to change. The first thing people noticed was his silence. In the days after he became president, Chester A. Arthur did not rush to make grand speeches. He did not declare sweeping plans. He did not reward loyalists with a flood of appointments. Instead, he mourned. He mourned publicly and privately for James A. Garfield, the man whose blood had cleared his path to power. Arthur understood something that few others fully grasped in that moment. Half the country did not trust him. Many believed he had been elevated by the same corrupt system that had indirectly produced Garfield's assassin. The killer, Charles Guiteau, had been a delusional office seeker who believed he deserved a government job and thought killing the president would earn him recognition. Patronage, the system Arthur had lived within for decades, now lay stained with presidential blood. Arthur knew the country was watching. He also knew his every action would define not only his presidency, but his legacy. Almost immediately, he made a symbolic decision that stunned Washington. He refused to move into the White House. Not at first. The building still contained Garfield's belongings, Garfield's family memories, Garfield's ghost. Arthur could not bring himself to step into it as if nothing had happened. When he finally did enter it, he found the mansion shabby and outdated. The White House in 1881 was nothing like the gleaming symbol Americans imagine today. It was worn, cluttered, and neglected. Arthur decided to transform it. He hired the most famous designer in America, Louis Comfort Tiffany, to renovate the interior. Tiffany filled the White House with rich colors, elegant glass, and modern style. Arthur even had dozens of wagon loads of old furniture removed, some of it dating back decades. Critics mocked him. They said he cared more about appearances than leadership, but they misunderstood what was happening. Arthur was not just redecorating a building, he was redefining himself. He abandoned many of his old political habits. He distanced himself from the machine that had made him. He began listening not just to loyalists, but to reformers. Still, few believed the change was real. They expected the old Arthur to return. Then Congress handed him a test that would define his presidency. For years, Americans had demanded reform of the spoils system, the practice of giving government jobs to political supporters, regardless of qualifications. Garfield's assassination had turned reform from a political issue into a moral crisis. In 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. It was revolutionary. It required that certain government jobs be awarded by merit, through examinations, not political connections. For a man like Arthur, it was deeply personal. This law would dismantle the very system that had built his career. Many of his old allies expected him to veto it. They believed he would protect the machine. But Arthur understood something they did not. America was changing. The presidency was changing. And so was he. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act became one of the most important reforms in American government history. It ensured that competence, not loyalty, would increasingly determine who served the public. Arthur had done what few thought possible. He had chosen country over machine. And yet, even as his public image improved, a private shadow loomed over his presidency. Arthur was dying. He had been diagnosed with Bright's disease, a serious and often fatal kidney condition. In the 1880s, there was no cure. He kept it secret. He continued working, continued governing, continued carrying the burden of the presidency, knowing his time might be short. Only a few close friends knew the truth. He grew thinner, more tired, but he never stopped. He modernized the U.S. Navy, which had fallen behind European powers. He supported new steel ships that would help transform America into a global naval force. He vetoed wasteful spending. He pushed for fairness in government. Gradually, something remarkable happened.
The man Americans had feared began earning their respect. Even his critics admitted he had surprised them. One observer famously said that no man ever entered the presidency so profoundly distrusted and left it so widely respected. Yet politics is rarely kind to those who change. By 1884, Arthur faced a difficult decision. Should he run for a full term as president? His health was failing, his political base was fractured, and reformers still did not fully trust him. He sought the Republican nomination anyway, but the party chose another path. They nominated James G. Blaine instead. Arthur's presidency would end after just one term. In the election that followed, the Republicans lost. The next president would be Grover Cleveland, a reformer and political outsider. Arthur prepared to leave office. He did so quietly. No dramatic farewell, no desperate attempt to cling to power. On March 4, 1885, he walked away from the presidency and returned to private life in New York. He was only 55 years old, but he was already fading. Without the responsibilities of office, his illness worsened quickly. He spent much of his time alone. Many Americans had already begun to forget him. Just 16 months later, on November 18, 1886, Chester A. Arthur died. He was 57. His passing barely shook the nation. No massive mourning, no towering legacy, at least not in public memory. And yet his story refused to disappear completely, because historians, looking back, began to see what his contemporaries had missed. They saw a man who had changed, a man who had risen from patronage politics and helped dismantle it, a man who had entered office under suspicion and left it with honor, a man who had carried the secret knowledge of his own death while serving his country. Even Mark Twain, never one to offer praise lightly, admired Arthur's transformation. Arthur never sought greatness. He never dominated history books like Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt. He did something quieter. He proved that people could change, that power did not always corrupt. Sometimes, unexpectedly, it redeemed. And that is why Chester A. Arthur remains the president who was almost forgotten. Not because he failed, but because his greatest achievement was not conquering enemies, winning wars, or delivering famous speeches. It was conquering himself. And in doing so, he helped change the presidency and the country forever. In the winter after he left the presidency, the city of New York carried on as it always had, restless, loud, and indifferent. Carriages rattled over frozen streets. Newspaper boys shouted headlines on corners. Steam rose from the breaths of horses and men alike. And somewhere behind the tall windows of a brownstone on Lexington Avenue, Arthur sat alone, listening to the quiet. It was a strange thing to go from being the most powerful man in the world to being almost no one at all. Only months earlier, senators had waited outside his office for permission to enter. Crowds had watched his every movement. His signature carried the force of law across an entire continent. Now, most days, no one knocked. He filled his hours with small routines. He read newspapers slowly, sometimes folding them away with a faint smile when he encountered arguments about the future of civil service reform, arguments about a system he had helped create. He walked when he could, though his strength was fading, and he spent long evenings sitting near the fire, thinking about the strange path his life had taken. Visitors noticed the change in him. He had always been elegant, always careful with his appearance. Even now, as illness hollowed his cheeks and weakened his frame, he dressed with precision. His suits were immaculate, his collars stiff and clean, his shoes polished. But there was something else now, a stillness, a man who knew time was running out. He did not speak often about his illness. Bright's disease was a quiet executioner. It did not kill quickly. It worked slowly, invisibly, draining life one day at a time. Arthur had known about it even while he was president. He governed an entire nation while carrying the knowledge that his own body was betraying him. Few presidents had ever ruled under such a shadow. And yet, if he felt bitterness, he rarely showed it. He had lived long enough to see something remarkable: respect. Not universal admiration, not the towering glory of the nation's most famous leaders, but respect, the kind that comes slowly, reluctantly, when people realize they have misjudged you. Newspapers that once mocked him now spoke more carefully. Political enemies who once dismissed him now spoke his name with something closer to fairness. Some even expressed gratitude, because the civil service reform he had signed, the law many thought he would destroy, was working. Government jobs were slowly becoming more professional, less political, less corrupt. It was only a beginning, but it was real. Arthur followed these developments with quiet satisfaction. He never claimed credit publicly. He didn't need to. He knew. Sometimes, in quieter moments, his thoughts drifted further back, to Vermont, to his father's voice, to the restless movement of his childhood, to the young man who had arrived in New York full of ambition and hunger. He must have wondered what that young man would think of him now, the machine politician who became a reformer, the forgotten vice president who became an unlikely president, a man who had been underestimated his entire life. One visitor, an old political acquaintance, later recalled sitting with Arthur during those final months. They spoke of politics, of Washington, of the future of the country.
Arthur listened more than he spoke. At one point, the visitor asked if he missed it. The power, the presidency. Arthur paused. He stared into the fire. When he answered, his voice was soft. He said he missed the work, not the power. The work. It was a revealing distinction, because for all his elegance, all his association with political machines, Arthur had come to see the presidency not as a prize, but as a responsibility, and he had carried it seriously, even when no one expected him to, even when no one believed in him. Outside his home, America was changing. The nation was growing westward. Railroads stretched across vast plains. Cities swelled with immigrants. Industry roared. The modern United States was being born. And in quiet ways, Arthur had helped shape it. Civil service reform would expand in the decades ahead, changing how government functioned. The Navy he had helped modernize would eventually project American power across oceans. The presidency itself would continue to evolve, shaped by men who followed him, men like Theodore Roosevelt, who would build upon the idea that government could serve the public with professionalism and purpose. Arthur did not live to see that future. By the fall of 1886, his condition had worsened severely. He grew weaker, more tired. Friends who visited could see the end approaching. On November 18, inside his New York home, Chester A. Arthur died. He was 57 years old. His death did not stop the nation. There were no massive public displays of grief, no vast crowds lining the streets. He was buried quietly beside his wife, Ellen, in Albany Rural Cemetery, and slowly, almost inevitably, he faded from public memory. New presidents came, new wars, new crises, new heroes. Arthur became a name in a list, a face in a portrait, a question on a school exam, forgotten. But history has a way of circling back. Decades later, historians began to look more closely at his presidency. They saw the context. They saw the expectations. They saw the transformation. And they realized something extraordinary. Chester A. Arthur had done something rare. He had surprised history. He had entered office as a symbol of corruption and left it as a symbol of reform. He had proven that leadership was not always about where you began. Sometimes it was about where you chose to go. Even now, his portrait hangs in the White House among the long line of presidents who carried the weight of the nation. Visitors walk past it every day. Most barely glance at it. They recognize the famous faces. They linger on the legends. And Arthur remains quiet. But his story remains. The story of the president who was almost forgotten. The man who never expected greatness. The man who was never expected to achieve it. And the man who did, anyway. At exactly 10:35 on the night of September 19, 1881, a messenger raced through the gas-lit streets of New York City, his breath fogging in the cool air, his heart pounding with the weight of the words he carried. Inside a quiet brownstone on Lexington Avenue, Chester Arthur was sitting in a chair, exhausted, half-dressed, and unable to sleep. For weeks he had been living in suspense. For weeks, the President of the United States had been dying. And Arthur knew that if the President died, he would become something he had never truly expected to be. A knock came at the door, urgent, sharp, final. When Arthur opened it, the messenger removed his hat. President Garfield is dead. For a moment, Chester Arthur said nothing. He simply stared, because in that instant, his entire life, every ambition, every mistake, every quiet compromise had led him here. He was now President of the United States, and almost no one trusted him. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning, to a cold October day in 1829, in the small rural town of Fairfield, Vermont. America was still young. Only 53 years had passed from independence. Most Americans lived in small towns. Roads were dirt, nights were dark, and the future was uncertain. Into this world, Chester Alan Arthur was born. Arthur's father, William Arthur, was an immigrant from Ireland, a fiery Baptist preacher who believed deeply in discipline, morality, and opportunity. He had come to America with almost nothing, driven by the belief that this new country offered something the old world did not, a chance. But chances in America did not come easily. The Arthur family moved constantly, following church assignments from town to town, never staying long in one place. Young Chester grew up in motion, new schools, new faces, new beginnings. It taught him something early, how to adapt, how to observe, how to survive. He was not the strongest boy, he was not the loudest, but he was sharp, very sharp. He watched people carefully. He understood, even as a child, that power did not always belong to the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it belonged to the quietest. He attended Union College in New York, graduating at just 18 years old, a serious young man with refined manners and growing ambition. But ambition alone did not open doors. Connections did. So Arthur did what many young men did in 1850s America. He went to New York City, and New York changed him forever. New York was not just a city, it was an engine. Ships arrived every day carrying immigrants from across the ocean. Factories roared, money moved, power moved, and behind it all, hidden in plain sight, was something else, the machine. Political machines controlled New York. They decided who got jobs, who got contracts, who got power. And they demanded loyalty in return. Arthur entered this world as a lawyer. He dressed well, spoke carefully, listened more than he talked. He built relationships, and slowly, patiently, he climbed. But before politics fully claimed him, he revealed something unexpected. In 1854, he took a case that few ambitious young lawyers wanted. A black woman named Elizabeth Jennings had been thrown off a streetcar because of her race. Segregation existed even in the North. Arthur took her case. He argued that she had been denied her rights, and he won. It was a quiet victory, but it mattered. It showed that Arthur believed in justice, at least at that point in his life, because soon the Civil War would change everything. When war erupted in 1861, Arthur did not charge into battle with a rifle. Instead, he served as quartermaster general for New York. His job was logistics, supplying soldiers, feeding them, clothing them, equipping them. It was not heroic work, but it was essential. Armies do not fight without supplies, and Arthur proved extremely good at it, efficient, organized, reliable. Powerful men noticed, including one of the most powerful politicians in America, Roscoe Conkling. Conkling was a kingmaker, a master of patronage, a man who understood that controlling jobs meant controlling government. He saw something in Arthur: loyalty, competence, ambition. He took Arthur under his wing, and Arthur entered the machine. In 1871, Conkling rewarded him. Arthur was appointed Collector of the Port of New York. It was one of the most powerful jobs in America. The port collected tariffs, the taxes on imported goods that funded the federal government. Billions in today's dollars passed through Arthur's hands, and more importantly, thousands of jobs. Arthur controlled them, and with those jobs came power. He became wealthy, famous, elegant. He wore silk hats, tailored suits. He redecorated his office in luxury. To reformers, he became a symbol of corruption. To machine politicians, he became a prince. But power in America is never permanent. In 1877, a new president took office, Rutherford Hayes. Hayes wanted reform. He wanted to break the machine, and he targeted Arthur. After a bitter political war, Hayes fired him. Arthur was humiliated, cast out. His career, many believed, was finished. But politics has a strange way of resurrecting the fallen. In 1880, the Republican Party was divided. They needed unity. They chose a compromise candidate for president, James A. Garfield. And for vice president, they chose Chester A. Arthur. It was a balancing act. Garfield represented reform. Arthur represented the machine. Most Americans barely noticed. Vice presidents rarely mattered. Arthur himself reportedly said the vice presidency was the most insignificant office. He would soon learn how wrong he was. On July 2, 1881, President Garfield walked into a train station in Washington. He was heading on vacation. He never made it. A gunman stepped forward, fired twice. Garfield fell. America froze. The president did not die immediately. He lingered for 79 days, in pain, in suffering, in uncertainty. And while he suffered, Arthur waited. He did not campaign. He did not maneuver. He stayed silent, watching, knowing that his moment might come. And when it did, everything would change. The oath was administered in silence. In the early hours of September 20th, 1881, inside his New York home, Chester A. Arthur stood in a dark suit, his face pale, his expression tight, with the weight of history pressing down upon him. There was no cheering, no applause, no celebration. Only a small group of witnesses and the heavy realization that he now carried the fate of the United States. Outside that room, the nation was uneasy, because the man who was now president had not been elected to lead. He had not been chosen for his vision. He had been chosen as a political compromise, and many Americans believed he represented the very corruption that had created the conditions for James A. Garfield's death. Rumors spread quickly. Newspapers questioned him. Cartoonists mocked him. Some feared the presidency itself had fallen into the hands of the political machine. Even his old allies weren't sure what he would do, because now Arthur faced a choice. He could become the man everyone expected, or someone no one imagined. He traveled to Washington soon after, his train cutting through towns filled with anxious citizens. When he arrived at the White House, he paused before entering. The building stood quiet, almost haunted. Inside were Garfield's belongings, Garfield's desk, Garfield's unfinished work. Arthur walked through the room slowly, carefully, as if stepping into another man's life. He understood something few others could. He was not supposed to be here. History placed him here. Violence placed him here. And now, he had to decide what kind of president he would be. At first, he moved cautiously. He kept Garfield's cabinet. He avoided sudden decisions. He listened. He observed. He learned. Washington watched him closely, waiting for signs of corruption, waiting for signs of weakness, waiting for signs that the machine had taken control. But those signs never came. Instead, something unexpected began to happen. Arthur began to change. Or perhaps he began to reveal a side of himself few had seen before. One of his first battles came from the issue that had haunted Garfield's presidency: patronage, the spoils system. For decades, government jobs had been handed out as rewards for political loyalty. It was how men like Arthur had risen. It was how power worked. But Garfield's assassin had been a failed office seeker, a man who believed he deserved a government job, a man who believed violence would earn him recognition. America was horrified, and reform was coming.
In 1883, Congress passed a law that would change the federal government forever: the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. It required government jobs to be awarded based on merit, not loyalty, not connections, not politics. Merit. For Arthur, it was deeply personal. This law would dismantle the very system that had made him powerful. His old mentor, Roscoe Conkling, expected him to veto it. Machine politicians expected him to protect them. They believed he owed them. They believed he was one of them. But Arthur surprised everyone. He signed it. With a single stroke of his pen, he began the slow death of the spoils system. His old allies were furious. They felt betrayed. But Arthur no longer belonged to them. He belonged to the presidency, and he intended to protect it. The transformation shocked Washington. Newspapers that had once mocked him began to reconsider. Political enemies watched him with new curiosity, because the man they had expected to be weak was showing strength. The man they had expected to be corrupt was showing independence. Even his appearance seemed to reflect the change. Arthur had always been known for his elegance. Now that elegance became something more: dignity. He carried himself differently, more serious, more deliberate, more presidential. But while his public strength grew, his private strength was fading. Arthur was dying. He had Bright's disease, a fatal kidney illness. He kept it secret from the public. Only a few trusted friends knew. Every day he grew weaker. Every day he grew more tired. And every day he continued to work. Because Arthur understood something most people never do. His time was limited, and he intended to use it well. He turned his attention to the military. At the time, the United States Navy was weak, outdated, still relying on wooden ships in an age of steel. European powers were advancing rapidly. America was falling behind. Arthur refused to accept that. He pushed for modernization: steel ships, modern weapons, a stronger navy. It was the beginning of a transformation that would one day make America a global power. But at the time, few noticed, few understood. Because Arthur himself remained overlooked, overshadowed, forgotten.
even while he was president. He also faced fierce battles over immigration. Millions were arriving from around the world, especially from China. Economic fears spread. Workers demanded restrictions. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, a law banning Chinese laborers from entering the United States. Arthur hesitated. He understood the anger, but he also understood the principle. He vetoed the first version of the law. Congress passed a weaker version. Arthur signed it reluctantly. It became the first major law restricting immigration based on nationality. It was controversial. It remains controversial. And it showed the complexity of Arthur's presidency. He was not perfect. He was not flawless. He was human, trying to lead a nation filled with conflict and change. By 1884, his presidency was nearing its end. His illness was worsening, his body weakening. But he still had one more decision to make. Would he run again? Would he fight to remain president? He tried, quietly, carefully, but his support was fading. The Republican Party chose another man. Arthur stepped aside. He did not protest. He did not rage. He accepted it. Because he knew something they did not. His time was ending anyway. On March 4, 1885, Arthur left the White House for the final time. He walked out the front door, got into a carriage, and disappeared into private life. No dramatic farewell, no desperate hands reaching for him, no great national mourning. There was only the sound of carriage wheels rolling over wet Washington streets as the man who had once held the most powerful office on earth quietly disappeared into ordinary life. He returned to New York, to the same brownstone on Lexington Avenue, where less than 4 years earlier, a knock on the door had changed his destiny forever. But he was not the same man who opened that door. The presidency had aged him. His hair was thinner, his body weaker, his face more lined. And inside him, the disease continued its slow, merciless work. Bright's disease was a thief. It stole strength first, then energy, then time. Arthur knew exactly what it was taking, and he knew how little he had left. At first, he tried to resume his old life. He met with friends, attended occasional dinners, spoke about politics in careful, measured words. But those who saw him closely noticed the truth. He tired easily. He walked slower. Sometimes he paused mid-conversation, as if searching for strength that was no longer there. Still, he never complained, not publicly. He carried his illness the same way he had carried the presidency, quietly, with dignity. America, meanwhile, moved on. A new president, Grover Cleveland, occupied the White House. New debates filled newspapers, new scandals, new ambitions. Arthur's name appeared less and less. He became a figure of the recent past, not forgotten entirely, but fading, like ink left too long in the sun. But something unusual began to happen. Slowly, quietly, people began to reconsider him. Civil service reform, the law he had signed despite his own political past, was working. Government positions were becoming more professional, more stable, less corrupt. It was only a beginning, but it was real.
And Arthur had made it possible. Even some of his former critics admitted it. He had done the right thing, even when it cost him politically, even when it cost him personally. In his home, Arthur spent more and more time alone. He read often, history, politics, biographies of men who had come before him, perhaps wondering how history would remember him, if it remembered him at all. One visitor later recalled a quiet evening sitting with Arthur near the fire. The room was dim. The city outside was alive with noise, but inside there was only stillness. Arthur spoke softly, reflectively, not about regret, but about responsibility. He said the presidency was never something a man truly owned. It was something he borrowed, something he carried, and then passed on. It was not a possession, it was a duty. Those words stayed with the visitor long after Arthur was gone. By 1886, his condition had worsened severely. He could no longer maintain the routines he once had. Walking became difficult. Even rising from a chair took effort. His world grew smaller, quieter. Friends visited less often, not out of neglect, but because they did not want to watch him fade. Arthur understood. He had spent his life observing people. He knew how they handled endings. On November 18, 1886, inside his New York home, Chester A. Arthur died. He was 57 years old. There was no national shutdown, no massive outpouring of grief. His funeral was dignified but modest. He was buried in Albany beside his wife, Ellen, the woman he had loved deeply and whose loss years earlier had left a wound he never fully revealed. And just like that, he was gone. In the years that followed, America surged forward. Industry exploded. Cities grew. Wars came and went. New presidents arose. Some became legends. Others became footnotes. Arthur became something even quieter than a footnote. He became a question, a name most Americans did not recognize, a face few could identify, the president who was almost forgotten. But history has a strange memory. It forgets loudly and remembers quietly. Decades later, historians began to look again, to examine the man behind the reputation, to understand the transformation. They saw the truth. They saw that Arthur had entered the presidency under a cloud of suspicion and left it under a sky of respect. They saw that he had dismantled part of the very system that had made him powerful. They saw courage, not the courage of the battlefield, but the rarer courage of change. Even Mark Twain, who had little patience for politicians, recognized Arthur's integrity. And as America entered the 20th century, the reforms Arthur had supported became the foundation of modern government. The professional civil service, the modern Navy, the idea that government existed to serve the people, not political machines. Arthur had helped make those things possible, even if few remembered his name. Today, his portrait still hangs in the White House. Visitors walk past it every day. They pause for George Washington. They admire Abraham Lincoln. They reflect on Franklin D. Roosevelt. And sometimes they pass Chester A. Arthur without stopping, without knowing, without realizing that the quiet man in the elegant suit once carried the fate of the nation and changed it. Not with war, not with speeches, but with something far more rare: character. Because Chester A. Arthur's story is not the story of a man who sought greatness. It is the story of a man who was given power unexpectedly and chose to use it wisely. A man who proved that the presidency does not make the man makes the presidency. And that is why he remains the president who was almost forgotten. If this journey through history sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell us which explorer or historical figure you want to uncover next, because the past is packed with bold risks, untold stories, and forgotten paths that quietly reshaped the world we live in today.